Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Sasquatch is a common but forbidden topic on 4chan. The cryptid phenomenon, or most commonly talked about Sasquatch, is a heavily censored and monitored topic. The government is so involved in this because it is a common occurrence that happens to people within the woods worldwide. Canada and America being the highest encounter rate. Numerous amount of different beings are encountered, Sasquatch being the most commonly reported. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the capabilities of Sasquatch, I recommend you listen to channels that go over people's encounters. They are spread out throughout the earth in remote or forested locations. Their capabilities are out of the ordinary. Invisibility, super speed, super strength, and other reality-breaking things that all cryptids have. Some cryptids are not as capable as others. If you think Sasquatch is a stupid ape being, then you will find all the stories on it fake. Bro, why didn't you just take a picture of it? You can't unless they let you. High levels of government look out for Sasquatch or paranormal activity when it is taking place. It seems when a legit citizen call is placed, they are somehow able to recognize that through technology or some way unknown to the public. Not always, but there is a high chance if you called the police for a real encounter. You'll get an unidentified military unit with helicopters come your way instead of your local police. There's special units to deal with this type of problem. The government, which is evil, doesn't when you interact with these things. Because I guess if you get into communication with a good one, and it decides to part with you powerful information through telepathic communications once established, they could cause the government some serious issues, and I'm sure they have been. They are not all good though, and some cryptids can fuck you up. So don't get all happy about an encounter. This is all from personal research and knowing people who have had some encounters. I would love it if anyone could drop some real info on this subject.
You're sort of correct. When you dial 911 and report you found a Sasquatch, there are people listening in on emergency channels who will respond out to these things. They are animals, though, and the government's response to them is keeping quiet due to lack of confidence in their population numbers. Not because they're magical creatures, they are precious North American animals, and the government doesn't want them to be extirpated because some assholes decided to go out there and poach an animal, just trying to do its own thing. They're literally 8 to 10 foot tall bipedal apes that bum around the forest and eat deer, mushrooms, and skunk cabbage. They're crepuscular, reclusive, and will most likely notice you far before you notice them. Please be nice to them.
They are not animals. They have mind-blowing capabilities. They can transform into other animals. They are also commonly spotted amongst UFOs. They are highly intelligent. I can't say that for all, though. The power of Sasquatch seem to differ depending on how successful their tribe is.
We'll start this thread off with one of the most compelling of all Bigfoot encounters. This is the case that stirred the imagination and talent of Roger Patterson, who would later go on to film the Patterson-Gimlin footage of a female Bigfoot walking briskly across a sandbank in Bluff Creek, October 1967. The testimony of William Rowe. Year, 1955. Season, fall. Month, October. Province, British Columbia. Country, Canada. Location details, 5 miles up Mika Mountain near an old deserted mine. Observed, ever since I was a small boy back in the forest of Michigan, I have studied the lives and habits of wild animals. Later, when I supported my family in northern Alberta by hunting and trapping, I spent many hours just observing the wild things. They fascinated me. But the most incredible experience I ever had with a wild creature occurred near a little town called Tête Jaune Cache, British Columbia, about 80 miles west of Jasper, Alberta. I had been working on the highway near Tête Jaune Cache for about 2 years. In October 1955, I decided to climb 5 miles up Mika Mountain to an old deserted mine, just for something to do. I came in sight of the mine about 3 o'clock in the afternoon after an easy climb. I had just come out of a patch of low brush into a clearing when I saw what I thought was a grizzly bear in the brush on the other side. I had shot a grizzly near that spot the year before. This one was only about 75 yards away, but I did not want to shoot it for I had no way of getting it out. So I sat down on a small rock and watched, my rifle in my hands. I could just see the top of the animal's head and the top of one shoulder. A moment later it raised up and stepped out into the opening. Then I saw that it was not a bear. This, to the best of my recollection, is what the creature looked like and how it acted as it came across the clearing directly towards me. My first impression was of a huge man, about 6 feet tall, almost 3 feet wide and probably weighing somewhere near 300 pounds. It was covered from head to foot with dark brown, silver-tipped hair. But as it came closer, I saw by its breasts that it was a female, and yet its torso was not curved like a female's. Its broad frame was straight from shoulder to hip. Its arms were much thicker than a man's arms, and longer, reaching almost to its knees. Its feet were broader proportionately than a man's, about 5 inches wide at the front and tapering to much thinner heels. When it walked, it placed the heel of its foot down first, and I could see the gray-brown skin or hide on the soles of its feet. It came to the edge of the bush I was hiding in, within 20 feet of me, and squatted down on its haunches. Reaching out its hands, it pulled the branches of bushes toward it and stripped the leaves with its teeth. Its lips curled flexibly around the leaves as it ate. I was close enough to see that its teeth were white and even. The head was higher at the back than at the front. The nose was broad and flat. The lips and chin protruded farther than its nose, but the hair that covered it, leaving bare only the parts of the face around the mouth, nose, and ears, made it resemble an animal as much as a human. None of its hair, even on the back of its head, was longer than an inch, and that on its face was much shorter. Its ears were shaped like a human's ears, but its eyes were small and black like a bear's. And its neck was unhuman, thicker and shorter than any man's I had ever seen. As I watched this creature, I wondered if some movie company was making a film at this place and that what I saw was an actor made up to look partly human and partly animal. But as I observed it more, I decided it would be impossible to fake such a specimen. Anyway, I learned later that there was no such company near that area. Nor, in fact, did anyone live up Mika Mountain, according to the people who lived in Tetajoncash. Finally, the wild thing must have got my scent, for it looked directly at me through an opening in the brush. A look of amazement crossed its face. It looked so comical at the moment I had to grin. Still in a crouched position, it backed up 3 or 4 steps, then straightened up to its full height and started to walk rapidly back the way it had come. For a moment it watched me over its shoulder as it went, not exactly afraid, but as though it wanted no contact with anything strange. The thought came to me that if I shot it, I would possibly have a specimen of great interest to scientists the world over. I'd heard stories about the Sasquatch, the giant hairy Indians that live in the legends of British Columbia Indians, and also, many claim, are still in fact alive today. Maybe this was a Sasquatch, I told myself. I leveled my rifle. The creature was still walking rapidly away, again turning its head to look in my direction. I lowered the rifle. Although I have called the creature it, I felt now that it was a human being, and I knew I would never forgive myself if I killed it. Just as it came to the other patch of brush, it threw back its head and made a peculiar noise that seemed to be half laugh and half language, and which I can only describe as a kind of whinny. Then it walked from the small brush into a stand of lodgepole pine. I stepped out into the opening and looked across a small ridge just beyond the pine to see if I could see it again. It came out on the ridge a couple of 100 yards away from me, tipped its head back again, and again emitted the only sound I had heard it make. But what this half laugh, half language was meant to convey, I do not know. It disappeared then, and I never saw it again. I wanted to find out if it lived on vegetation entirely or ate meat as well, so I went down and looked for signs. I found it in 5 different places, and although I examined it thoroughly, could find no hair or shells of bugs or insects, so I believe it was strictly a vegetarian. I found one place where it had slept for a couple of nights under a tree. Now the nights were cool up the mountain, at this time of year especially, and yet it had not used a fire. I found no sign that it possessed even the simplest of tools. nor a single companion while in this place. Whether this creature was a Sasquatch, I do not know. It will always remain a mystery to me unless another one is found. I hereby declare the above statement to be in every part true, to the best of my powers of observation and recollection. William Rowe, sworn before William Clark, a commissioner for oaths in and for the province of Alberta. Follow-up investigation report by Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization investigator John Green. In addition to the information in this sworn statement, Mr. Rowe made the following remarks regarding the Sasquatch in a letter. The nails were not like a bear's, but short and heavy like a man's fingernails are. Its eyes were not light and large, but small and black like a bear's. You couldn't see any knotted, corded muscles. This animal seemed almost round. It was as deep through as it was wide, and I believe if this animal should have been 7 feet tall, it would have weighed close to 500 pounds. We have got to get away from the idea of comparing it to a human being as we know them. I never did meet Mr. Rowe, and I knew very little about him. But in 1969, on a trip across Canada, I met 2 zoologists in different cities who had corresponded with him concerning his observations of buffalo. They both considered him to be a well-qualified and reliable student of wildlife. The sighting of William Rowe has of course been dissected 7 ways to Sunday. Critics most often point to the appearance of the creature's breasts as reported by Rowe and drawn by his daughter at his direction. They point to the fact that no other apes have hair on their breasts. Rowe's description is that the breasts did have hair with the exception of the area immediately surrounding the nipples. It should be pointed out that other primates, including human females, do have hair on their breasts. The hair is typically very thin, downy, short, and lighter in color than the hair on the rest of their body, but it is there. Some feel that perhaps the hair of the Sasquatch remains constant in thickness and color over a higher percentage of its body than does the hair on humans or even other great apes. Why this would be is of course subject to speculation. To others, the hair on the breasts is a huge red flag that could indicate a hoax. The most common criticisms involving the details described by William Rowe are actually not criticisms of his sighting at all. Rather, they are criticisms leveled directly at Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin and the Sasquatch they claim to have captured on film at Bluff Creek in October of 1967. Many who feel that the creature filmed by Patterson that day is nothing more than a man in a suit point to the similarities between Patty, as the Patterson subject came to be known, and the creature described by William Rowe. The crowned head, the long arms that nearly reach the knees, the thick torso that does not taper from chest to waist, and yes, the hair-covered breasts of the Patterson subject all are reminiscent of the creature described by Rowe. Critics feel that it is likely Roger Patterson and any accomplices he might have had modeled their ape suit after the Rowe creature. While there is no proof this is what happened, no ape suit has ever been found. It has failed to deter hardcore critics from making this connection.
In the late 1890s, near the Chetco River in southern Oregon, a dozen loggers and their families encountered a great beast with disastrous results. Camping in tents by the river, the lumbermen would awaken each morning to find their freshly cut timber, which required 3 men to move, carelessly scattered about like matchsticks. Huge human footprints left in the damp earth were the only clues. Since they had been having trouble with bears, the men followed the footprints through the torn shrubbery and uprooted saplings until they disappeared. That night, the loggers were awakened by shrill screams of something not quite human in the near underbrush. Seizing a rifle, one man lit a torch and headed into the darkness. He was quickly followed by several other men. In a very short time, the first man rushed back to collapse in terror at the feet of his tracking companions. He babbled incoherently about a hairy monster 8 feet tall with yellow eyes, fangs, and hands like a man. His description put the camp in an uproar. The next night, 2 men decided to track and kill the hairy intruder. They carried a small lantern and loaded rifles and disappeared into the darkness behind the tents. Back in camp, their friends heard screams and shrieks and the sounds of gunfire. Then, silence. When the 2 men did not reappear, the other loggers grabbed lanterns and torches and, while firing their guns into the air, set out in search of their comrades. A half-mile from camp, they found the scene of a desperate struggle. Broken and bleeding, arms and legs ripped from the torsos, their two friends lay scattered all over the place. They had been slammed against trees and torn into pieces by something with incredible strength. Blood dripped into small pools from branches high in the trees, as well as from the crushed greenery of the surrounding shrubs. But of the hairy creature responsible, there were only bloody footprints leading deep into the woods. The loggers struck camp and left the area the next day. Professional hunters entered the forest in the days that followed, but found no sign of the creature.
How tall is this Bigfoot? This is the rough size of the Bigfoot I saw. I drew the picture and then went on Google Earth and took a picture of where I saw it. I was driving westbound on Highway 152 approaching Casa de Fruta, California. This is a road I've traveled back and forth at various hours throughout my life. I have traveled it at least 500 to 1,000 times over the past 12 years. I've been visiting and reading Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization reports since 2004 or so, and I've done a lot of exploring around my area, mostly at night with friends. I stopped exploring via night hikes during my early 20s after a few close encounters with wildlife, boars and mountain lions. Oftentimes, we would go out in search of anything paranormal we could find, which was typically never much. A few odd things have happened, but nothing involving a Bigfoot. On this particular drive, I was heading from one city to another to visit my family. I happened to be traveling late at night this time around. If you look at a map, I was on the stretch of highway between the fire station in that area and the small town of Casa de Fruta, heading westbound towards Casa de Fruta. The Bigfoot began stepping towards my car and walking from the dirt onto the eastbound highway as my car passed on the westbound side. I'm not good at judging distances, but I would say it was about 50 feet away. It was dark out, and my headlights illuminated its body as I quickly passed. I was probably traveling around 70 to 75 miles per hour, so it all happened very quickly. There was almost no traffic around except 2 to 4 cars, and they were all at least half a mile apart. One was eastbound in front of me, and the other was westbound a ways behind me. I remember looking in my review mirror trying to see if I could see anything. I couldn't. I lightly hit the brakes to see if my lights would light anything up, but they didn't. I considered turning around, but there was nowhere to turn around except the Casa de Fruta exit, and by the time I would have gotten back to that area, I thought it would have likely been gone. I just continued driving and said to myself, well, I finally saw one. As I said earlier, I wrote down how it looked with greater detail in my book, as the experience was still fresh in my head when compared to today. What I can recall right now about its appearance was that it was shorter than I expected. Or perhaps I just wasn't close enough. What did shock me a little was how wide it was. It had a very large and wide torso, large wide arms, large wide legs, and a small, albeit wide, head. I recall it had a slight cone shape to the head. The fur was a dark orange color. It sort of looked like it was wearing dirty rags. I assume the fur was matted. Its face was not free of fur. In fact, I could hardly make out any features. I couldn't see a mouth or nose. I only saw its eyes. The eyes didn't glow, but had a very light reflective quality to them. I would describe the reflective quality as silver in color, and it's hard to say what the facial expression was through the fur, but it immediately struck me as stern. It must have been about 2 a.m., but it easily could have been around midnight or 1 a.m., maybe even as late as 3:30 a.m. It was dark out, partially cloudy if I recall correctly, but I could be wrong. It was definitely not raining. If there was a moon out, it wasn't full, as the fields around this area are fairly well lit under a full moon. The only thing that really lit up the Sasquatch was my, not-so-bright, headlights. It should also be noted that the year could have been 2016, 2017, or 2018. However, it was more likely that it was late 2017 or early to mid-2018, as I spent most of 2018 writing a book, and I used this experience in the book. At the time, it still felt fresh in my mind. I've written 2 books, currently working on my 3rd, and in my 2nd book I have a few characters come up against a pack of Bigfoot. I used my experience to describe the details of how Sasquatches in the book look. The book doesn't focus on Bigfoot, but rather a group of friends who go out into the woods for adventures at night. I thought I would throw my experience into the book. Other details: Casa de Fruta, California. Highway 152. Highway 152, a well-traveled highway on the outskirts of the Santa Clara Bay Area. I would describe the area as an oak savanna surrounded by mountains and woods, near the south end of the Henry Coe State Park. As mentioned in the report, it was just me in the car, but a couple of other cars were on the highway that night.
13 feet tall. There was a Mercedes SUV like the one in the pic next to me at the gas station 15 minutes ago. They are surprisingly tall cars.
Thank you, friend.
This happened on a Sunday morning at about 10:30 in the morning. 4 of us were in a small car and went to the top of a hill where fields and hills were rolling off into the distance. In the fields, there are a few bushes and trees scattered about. The car was sitting perpendicular to this one field and hill. I looked up and saw 4 very dark and large creatures walking upright on the hill. At first, I thought they were bears, but why 4? And why are they walking upright? They were taller than the bushes, but not quite as tall as the mature apple trees. They all looked somewhere between 7 to 12 feet tall. They were dark, very dark for how bright it was. Although they appeared hairy, I could not make out any features except that they were shaped very much like all the Bigfoot drawings that I have seen. Large head, large shoulders, huge chest, long arms, etc. I'm sitting in the back seat behind the driver closest to this field. When I yelled to get everyone to look, I could see 4 of them, but one was disappearing over the top of the hill. As the driver looked up, he only saw 3 of them. Then my girlfriend beside me saw them, and she only saw 2. The last person only saw 1. They had covered a good 80 to 100 yards in mere seconds, but seemed to only be lumbering along. I guess none of that part really matters, but it really kind of freaked us all out. Was this some kind of a warning or a foreboding? I would go first, and then the driver, and so on. We had planned to get out of the car and hang out there for a while. But it was so eerily quiet. No cows, no birds, and even the insects seemed quiet. There were no odors, but we were downwind. It scared 4 country kids pretty well. The unnatural silence was what really got us. We decided to leave and go somewhere else.
On the trip in question, I decided to hike the old Molalla Indian Trail that followed the ridgetops from Saddle Blanket Mountain to Oak Ridge, one of the Native Americans' favorite summer camps and trading centers. It was a beautiful August day, 2 days into the hike. I expected to be gone for about 2 weeks, when literally out of the blue, the most terrifying thing that ever happened to me in my life occurred. It would change my perspective of reality forever. I was walking along the trail enjoying the strong breeze and bright sunshine when, in the middle of a step, everything around me started to turn gray and blurry. The only way I can describe it was as if suddenly I was looking through someone else's prescription sunglasses. I finished the step and started another. Every inch I moved forward, the darkness increased and the gray blurring turned into a jumble of shapes that made no sense. I then seemed to pass a barrier and everything started to return back into focus. When my foot reached the ground on the second step, everything around me had changed. Day had turned into night and there was no wind. All the Douglas fir and pine trees had been replaced with thick jungle-like growth. The cool, thin mountain air was replaced with humid, thick air. There were no stars in the sky, but there was a diffused light that let me see everything clearly. However, I couldn't tell what the light source was. As often happens when the human body receives a massive dose of adrenaline, the entire incident appeared like it was in slow motion, and even though I was only there for a second or two, I had time to observe my surroundings. The silence was broken by continuous high-pitched keening sound, and I was nearly overwhelmed with a sense of fear and danger. My momentum caused me to take one more step before stopping in my tracks. It was at this point I heard a whispered, "Gotcha," over my right shoulder. I couldn't tell if I heard it with my ears or inside my head. The word wasn't directed at me, but something said the word quietly to itself. I was so terrified I actually felt my heart stop for a moment. That whispered word is what saved me. I opened my mouth and gasped in a huge gush of thick air and recoiled backward in the same footsteps I had entered wherever I was. As I threw myself backward, I looked over my right shoulder. A dark-colored hairy right hand and arm was reaching for my throat over my shoulder. The hand had pale ivory spade-shaped fingernails. The nails looked clean and almost had a manicured look to them. The thumb was placed lower, towards the wrist, on the hand, than a human's is. Both hands and arms were thin and powerful looking, and both were covered with thick, coarse black hair. I got a good look at it because the thumbnail grazed my neck. It did not break the skin, as I moved backwards. As I continued backwards, the hand clutched where my neck had been a split second before, and it seemed to fade off into the distance as I returned through the portal. I took 2 more steps backwards, and everything reversed itself from what had just happened. The world around me became lighter, the fir and pines gradually came back into view, and by the 3rd step I was back on Saddle Blanket Mountain.
Be me. Be around 7. Walking back late with parents from a relative's place, walking near a gigantic open playing field with a small forest. Mother freaks out and says that she saw something. Said it looked like a huge man covered in hair. Said it was practically snarling at me, but I didn't notice it. She's hyperventilating. Never seen her like this, so I'm kind of freaked out. She's begging my dad to call the cops. Father calms her down eventually. We start walking again. As we're right next to the playing field, I feel something weird in my mind. Kind of felt like someone suddenly dropped something onto me or something. Don't actually feel it on my body. It was more like I felt their intention to stop me on that spot. It's hard to describe. My shoes are stuck to the ground. I mean literally stuck. Dad, who is strong as hell, can't lift my feet off the ground. He looks over into the field and I see it in his face when he realizes that something is really wrong here. I start to freak out. Mother suddenly starts acting really strange. Doesn't sound like herself. She tells my dad to leave me there and come back for me tomorrow. WTF? Dad unties my shoes and picks me up out of my shoes. He kicks something, and I look down. He tried to kick over my shoes, and they still wouldn't budge. He says we are GTFO here and carries me back the rest of the way. We're back, and Mother has a seizure and passes out. This has never happened before. Dad checks her, and then sits staring into space with a weird look on his face. Asks me if when I was stuck, I could feel something out there in the darkness. Says he has never felt anything like that before. Go to bed. Next morning, neither of them could remember getting back that night.
Reminds me of a story I heard from this hunter. Goes on a hunting trip with a buddy. Him and his mate split up and headed to their spots to set up their hides. As he's nearing his spot, he hears a sound like something quickly and very loudly crawling through leaves and bushes. It's getting closer, coming straight for him. A deer runs from the direction of the sound and past him. There's something else behind it. This weird ASF thing darts out from the undergrowth, totally black. It's on all fours, really long, thin limbs. Its head is perfectly still and level. Limbs are just tearing shit up and carrying it forward. Almost looks comical. Guy thinks it's a big lizard because of the limb proportions and the way it runs just like a lizard. Then he realizes it's covered in fur, so it can't be a lizard, and it darts around him. Couldn't get a good look at its face, it just looked black. He's thinking it must be some sort of undocumented forest critter. It disappears into the forest and he hears the deer cry out. Weird critter must have got his meal. He's thinking at least it wasn't interested in me. Sets up his hide. About 30 or 45 minutes or so go by when he hears something approaching from the direction the critter went. It's back, and this time it's standing on 2 legs. He's getting nervous now. As it gets closer, it notices him and looks up. Creature with no hair on the face, but dark, almost black skin. Large, black, almond-shaped eyes with a hint of white at the edges. Nose like a gorilla. Long, thin, lipless mouth. He starts shouting at the thing, cussing and threatening it. It opens its mouth and sort of grins at him without making a sound. Has huge, square-shaped teeth that were so big he could only see like 3 or 4. It just walks off into the forest. Shook up, but nothing else happened. Later, he meets back up with his buddy and he says he saw the same thing.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.